Okay. So I know that chapter 3 and 9 is not actually on the midterm, but it's a super important chapters. And so I'm going to try to be as detailed as possible. And also I'm going to post this. So I definitely recommend, because I'm sure you're all probably not super focused on this chapter since it's not relevant for the midterm. But definitely, like, after the midterm, take a look at the recording again if you have any questions, because this is a very important topic for future chapters. So we're going to basically be talking about international trade, and kind of a good way to think about international trade is to remember back to consumer and producer surplus, because the idea of surplus is really, really important when you're thinking about trade and who benefits from trade. So before we get started kind of thinking about trade and the benefits, we first should remember or learn what a production possibility frontier is. So a production possibility frontier is basically just a graph that shows two combinations of goods that the economy can produce given the available resources and technology in the economy. So in this example, we have a production possibility frontier. So you can see here, all we're really doing is we're taking the various points where a country can produce wheat or a country can produce computers and just mapping those points. So it's basically, we're just mapping the ability of a country or company to produce either, in this case, computers or wheat at various points along their curve. So when we think about production possibility frontiers, notice that in this example, it was a straight line, or it was linear. So for this, what we're really going to try to do is think about it as a production possibility frontier would normally be. Actually, let me see. A couple people messaged me that my mic was not. So let me see if I can fix that.
Is that a little better with, can everyone hear me a little better with that versus
yes.
before? Okay. Awesome. Okay, cool. So when we're talking about a production possibility frontier, notice that this one is actually bowed outward. And there's a very specific reason for that. So the production possibility frontier is bowed outward because of decreasing opportunity costs. And we'll kind of get more into that in chapter 13 and 14. But the important point to know here is that when you're looking at a production possibility frontier, there are certain points that are possible and certain points that are not possible. So in this case, we can see that points A, B, and C are all possible points. And the reason they're possible is because they're on the production possibility frontier line. So this country is able to produce this specific combination of pizza and sugar. So at point A, B, and C. Point D, though, is possible, but it's not efficient. And the reason it's not efficient is because if you think about point D, you could get more pizza and not give up any sugar. And the same is true in the inverse. So you could get more sugar and not give up any pizza. And a reason why point D sometimes will occur is because you have unemployment or some sort of like reason that the resources in the economy are not being fully used. And then finally, point E, which is really what we'll get into later, is not possible at this point. But point E actually is possible with trade. And so that's a really important piece here, because with the domestic economy, there's no way for you to get point E because it's outside of the curve. But with trade, trade allows countries to actually achieve additional productivity or get additional goods because it actually shifts their curve. So they can achieve those greater points. And so this is just basically kind of summarizing that. But the really important point here that I really want to point out is the opportunity cost point, because that kind of is what underlies a lot of international trade discussions. So opportunity cost, all we're really talking about is just the cost of what we have to give up to obtain that item. So for instance, if we're looking at this graph, think about what is the opportunity cost of moving from point C to point B. And so in this case, the opportunity cost, and I can show it, is basically we are getting less sugar, but we're getting more pizza. And so that trade-off between sugar and pizza is the opportunity cost of moving from point C to point B. Does anyone have any questions on the production possibility frontier or opportunity costs? Okay, excellent. So I'm going to skip past a lot of this because it's basically just reiterating kind of opportunity costs and production possibility frontiers. But one final thing that I wanted to point out is that the production possibility frontier in a country can shift without international trade. And the reason why it can shift is if the economy grows. So think about it, if the economy grows, what that means is that there is or are additional resources or an improvement in technology. And so that basically shifts how much wheat or computers this specific economy can produce. So because of that, we used to be able to produce only 5,000 tons of wheat, but because of economic growth, we're now able to produce 6,000. And the same is true for computers as well. So it's not just international trade that can cause the production possibility frontier to allow us to get to points that are outside of the curve. It's also because of economic growth too. Okay. So now let's take a look at a very simple country or a very simple example of opportunity costs. So in this example, we have the United States and China. And so we basically have here the US producing food and China producing food and clothing. So basically the US can produce either 5 units of food or 3 units of clothing, or China can produce 3 units of food and 1 unit of clothing. So to really understand where what the trade-offs are, we need to compute the opportunity costs. So to do that, all we're going to do is just take, for example, so the US has this trade-off for food. So all we're going to do is take clothing over food, and that gives us the opportunity cost of producing food. And so we do that for all of the goods to determine how the countries are going to trade. And so let me pause here just to make sure everyone's on the same page before I move to the next step of the problem.
So do you just do the food, no, the clothing over the food for the food? And then, okay.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Yeah. And that same format is going to be true for every single opportunity cost problem. So basically, for instance, for the food, we can see that it's 3/5, and we can see that we got 3 from clothing and 5 from food. And so that basic setup is going to be true for kind of all of our opportunity cost problems when we're thinking about how to determine the opportunity cost.
So is it like basically like the other good over the original?
Yes. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, like if you wanted to do for this one, if I wanted to write like a little formula for food, it would be clothing over food. And for clothing, it would just be the opposite of that. So in this case, it would be food over clothing.
And then when you compare, are you comparing the US opportunity cost within itself, or you're comparing it to China? So would you compare 3/5 to 1/3, or would you compare 3/5 to 5/3?
Yeah, so in this case, you would compare the 3/5 to 5/3, or sorry, the 3/5 to 1/3, and then the 5/3 to 3. Because you're basically trying to determine with opportunity cost, who has the lowest opportunity cost for that specific good. And so if we move to the next example, we can actually see who is going to specialize in what type of good production. So we can see here that the US actually has the lowest opportunity cost for clothing, and China has the lowest opportunity cost for food. So because of that, the US is going to specialize in clothing production, and China is going to specialize in food production. And that is the case, even though we can see here that the US is able to produce more food and clothing than China. So this is kind of how we get into discussing absolute and comparative advantage when we're looking at opportunity cost. But does this process make sense, or does anyone have any questions on this process before we move on?
Can I ask you a quick question? Like I understand what you're teaching, but is this slide also available on Blackboard? Just I kind of had the curiosity.
Yeah. So all these slides are available in the, I think it's required and graded materials under each chapter.
Yeah. Is this chapter 3 or is this all combined?
Combined. So this is under chapter 3 and 9.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So then the next step, and this is, I think, one of the steps that can be the most confusing, is frequently in problems, they will ask you, what are the terms of trade? And so all they really mean by that are under what terms would these countries trade? So basically, how much food and clothing, or what would the rate of food and clothing be? So the US and China would actually trade goods with one another. And so it's actually really easy to determine that. All we need to do is just take a look at the opportunity costs. So for example, for clothing, the terms of trade for both countries to benefit is going to have to be between 5/3 and 3. And so for food, it's going to have to be between 1/3, which is China's opportunity cost of food, and 3/5, which is the US's opportunity cost for food. So basically, when a question asks you, what are the possible terms of trade? It's all you have to do is just know that it's going to be between the two opportunity costs. And the reason for that is because for both countries to benefit from trade, the trading terms have to be between the first country's opportunity cost and the second country's opportunity cost. And if that's the case, then both countries will benefit from trade. And so when we're talking about kind of terms of trade, we have to talk about specialization. And all specialization really is basically just when a person, business, or country focuses on production of that good that they are best at producing. And the reason why they do this is because it allows for maximum production of that good. So in this case, in the prior example, we saw that the US was actually best at producing clothing. So the US was going to focus and specialize in clothing. And China was actually best in food production. So China was going to specialize in food production. So that's all we're saying with specialization, is just that the countries are going to specialize and focus in the production of the good that they have the lowest opportunity cost compared to the other country. So when we're talking about opportunity costs, we have two really important types of advantages that we need to talk about. The first is an absolute advantage. And that just basically means you can produce just in total more than the other country. And in this case, I have an example of California, Nebraska, and the differences in production of artichokes and cattle. So in this case, we can see that California has an absolute advantage in the production of artichokes, and Nebraska has an absolute advantage in the production of cattle. Basically, all the absolute advantage is asking you is just who has the ability to produce in total more of the good. Whereas comparative advantage, this is where we get into opportunity costs, because comparative advantage is basically just asking us who is able to produce a good at the lower opportunity cost compared to another. And so for this, we have to compute the opportunity costs. And so I have an example right here that we're going to kind of walk through where we can actually see what that looks like. Because initially, when we're looking at Lorenzo and Nihah, we see that Lorenzo is actually able to produce more corn and rye than Nihah. So Lorenzo has an absolute advantage in both goods, but it's unlikely that Lorenzo is going to have a comparative advantage in both goods. Okay, so when we're looking at the comparative advantage, this is what we should think about. So we already kind of went over the process, but just to reiterate kind of what it looks like when you are actually like speaking it, or when you're actually kind of saying it, or how it could look in a example, or how it could look on the exam. So for this one, so Lorenzo's opportunity cost of producing 1 bushel of rye is 5 bushels of corn. So you're basically just taking corn over rye, like we talked about before. And for corn, then you're just going to say Lorenzo's opportunity cost of producing 1 bushel of corn is 1/5 bushel of rye. So you just take 8 bushels of rye over the 40 bushels of corn. Okay. So now we're going to do a top hat question and see if this process is kind of making sense. Okay, so this question is basically asking us, which of the below options indicates who has the correct comparative advantage? And so we're looking at the same example that we just talked about with Lorenzo and Nihah, and we're trying to determine who has the comparative advantage. Is it Lorenzo in total, Nihah in total, or are they splitting the comparative advantage? So I'll give maybe a couple minutes for you all to answer this, and let me know if you have any questions. Okay, and maybe another 30 seconds. So if you have not answered already, make sure to answer.
Professor, does it show that I answered?
Yeah, so yeah, we'll go over the answer afterwards.
Okay.
Okay, and I think there should just be a couple more people to answer, and then we can go over the answer. Okay, so I'm going to close this and we can review the answer. Okay, so let's take a look at the correct answer. Okay, great. So it looks like most people got the correct answer. So basically the correct answer was neon rye and Lorenzo in corn. And so the reason for that was, if you look up here, so when we're comparing the opportunity costs, so we can see for this first example, let me kind of group them together so it's maybe a little easier to see. But so we have the first two here, and so these are for rye. And so in this example, what we're looking for is who has the lowest opportunity cost. And then for corn, we're looking at who has the lowest opportunity cost. And so we can see that in this case, Niha has the lowest opportunity cost for rye. And then for corn, we can see that Lorenzo does. So basically that's all kind of the process that you're going to work through, is just making sure that you can determine who has the lowest opportunity cost for each good. And then that's all the process is for kind of all of these opportunity cost questions, because we just really want to think through who is going to have to give up the smallest amount to be able to produce this good. And so there's another example that I wanted to go through. In this example, I think is a little more complicated, but I think it's good to kind of work through this example as well. So this example, kind of a similar setup, but here it's asking or giving you the time it takes to produce one aircraft in hours and the time it takes to produce one shirt in hours. And so the question's asking us, which good will China export and which good will the US export? And I think this is a problem from one of the Cengage examples. But for this one, we can't actually compute the opportunity cost right away because the terms here, or the comparison between the countries, is not actually in the same units, because here we're actually looking at the time it takes to produce one aircraft in hours versus the time it takes to produce one shirt in hours. So we're kind of trying to compare things here that are not the same. So to actually convert them into being in the same type of units, we actually have to take them over or divide them by 1 hour, which we can see right here. So for aircraft, we actually have to take 1 hour over the time it takes to produce one aircraft. And we have to do that for shirts in aircrafts. So when we do that, then we can compare these numbers here, because now they're all over 1 hour. So we can actually see what the correct comparison is here. And so when we do that, we actually are just going to take now our normal process. So for aircraft, we're going to take the 0.5 shirts and divide that by the 0.000100 of aircrafts. And that's going to give us the opportunity cost for the United States in aircraft. And we're going to do that for each good until we get the opportunity cost. And so we can see here that for the United States, when compared to China, they have a lower opportunity cost of producing aircrafts. And China has a lower opportunity cost of producing shirts. So then that's how we can determine the correct opportunity cost. Does anyone have any questions on this one? Because the format is basically the same as the one we reviewed the last time. It's just important to remember that when doing opportunity cost, you actually have to think about and make sure that the comparison between both of the goods is in the same unit, because otherwise it would be like comparing apples to oranges. And when we're doing opportunity costs, we always need to determine basically an apples to apples comparison.
Yeah, I got one question. In this case, what you did was to get 0.50, you just did 1 divided by 2 and the same thing for 4.
Exactly.
Okay, is that because it says 1 hour shirt production? Is that why?
Yes. Yeah. And for this one, and for kind of questions similar to this, if you ever see something and it gives you the amount of labor time it takes to produce something, and it's not in the same unit initially, you have to convert it to being in the same unit.
Got you. All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Professor, I have a question.
Yeah.
If the time it took to produce one shirt, if for both US and China was 2 hours, would you still need to convert into like the same variable?
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying. So like, for example, if this was actually 2.
Yeah.
So yes. And the reason why is because even though their shirt production would be the same, the aircraft production would still be different.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Do anyone else have any other questions on this one? Okay. So now that we understand opportunity costs in comparative and absolute advantage, now we can actually start talking about international trade. So I know a really big buildup, but now we're actually talking about international trade. So when we're talking about international trade, the most important piece of this slide that I want you to remember is this and this. So in our normal demand and supply curves that we've been seeing for the entire semester, we have always been looking at the domestic market. And what I mean by domestic market is just the amount of demand and supply that are in the country. So like, for example, if we're looking at, let's say the market for cheese, we're looking at that in the United States, not in the world. But when we're talking about international trade, now we have to think about there is a supply and demand curve for the entire world in cheese. And so because of that, there's going to be a worldwide equilibrium price for that good. And so when there is a worldwide equilibrium price, usually the domestic price and the worldwide price, usually those are not the same. It's very, very uncommon that those are the same. And so when they're not the same, that's when we can benefit from international trade. So let's take a look first at a country that's exporting soybeans. So in the domestic market, we can see that the equilibrium price is going to be $4, and the equilibrium quantity is going to be 500. But let's say that the world price was $6. So this is the world price. So now what happens is this country, their demand and supply are not in alignment. So previously, when we were talking about like price ceilings and price floors, if there was a difference between supply and demand, in this case, we would call this a surplus. But because we're talking about international trade now, there is actually going to be an export of that surplus. So basically, because the domestic price in this market is below the worldwide price, this country is going to export those goods. So basically, the exports are going to be the difference between 750 and 300. And so you get that from taking a look at where the price intersects the supply curve for 750 and where the price intersects the demand curve at 300. So domestic consumers in this market are going to consume 300 units of the good, and producers are going to produce 750. So the difference between 750 and 300 is going to be 450. And so that means that this country is going to export 450 units of the good. So now when we're thinking about surplus, though, this is where the benefit from international trade comes. This little triangle right here, this is additional benefit that this country would not have been able to achieve if they had not traded. So previously, without trade, consumer surplus is A and B. So we think about normal consumer surplus just being this area above the equilibrium price. And then producer surplus is going to be this area. So the area below the equilibrium price. So just our normal supply or normal consumer surplus and producer surplus. But now with trade, we actually get a totally different benefit. So with trade, consumers now only get A. So consumers are actually worse off, which is kind of weird. But producers are better off because they have B, C, and this new chunk here, D, that is a gain from trade. So our total surplus is increased and producers are getting a greater surplus, even though in this example, consumers are actually getting less surplus than they did without trade. So that's kind of the weird thing about trade is that frequently when countries trade, it's not going to benefit consumers and producers. It's only going to benefit either consumers or producers, but overall, everyone's going to benefit. So that's why for trade, it's really important to remember that in almost all scenarios, everyone's going to benefit from trade. But domestic consumers and domestic producers might not necessarily benefit from trade. Okay, and before I move on to the next example, does anyone have any questions about this? Okay. So now let's talk about tariffs. So tariffs are basically just a tax on imported goods. So if we're thinking about an example, let's say that the world price for cotton shirts here is $20 and the government levies a tariff of $10. So now consumers in this market are going to have to pay $30 for an imported shirt. So then what happens is because of that, domestic producers, previously, they were charging a price of $20 before the tariff. But now because of the tariff, domestic producers can raise their prices to $30 as well. So it matches the new price for imported shirts. So what this usually means when we're looking at kind of an analysis of what happens is that the demand from domestic consumers decreases, where the supply for domestic consumers increases. So you can see here that supply is increasing, demand is decreasing because the price increased. So now what that means is that the difference here, so this difference is going to be the amount of imports after the tariff. And so that difference is basically just going to be, in this case, 30. So the difference between 40 and 70. So notice before, in our example where we had free trade, there were 55 imports of t-shirts. But with the tariff, now there's actually going to be less imports because there's that tax on imported goods. And so that increases the price that domestic consumers and producers are going to get for their goods. So then when we look at an analysis of what happens with a tariff, it can get kind of complicated. But I think this is a really good way to think about it through kind of looking at the different chunks of surplus here. So we can see in the example here. So we have consumer surplus after the tariff is going to be this. So consumer surplus is A and B. Producer surplus is going to be C and G. Government revenue, because remember, a tariff is basically just a tax, is going to be E. And finally, deadweight loss is going to be F and D. And the reason why there's deadweight loss is because, similar to a tax, there is a decrease in the amount of quantity that is produced. So because of that, there's going to be these deadweight loss triangles. And I will just say an important caveat with this. When you're computing deadweight loss, it's still the same formula. So the 1/2 base times height formula that we use to find the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and prior deadweight loss. But it is not always the case that D and F are going to be the same size. Basically that if you compute F, that does not necessarily mean that you don't have to compute D. So I always recommend to students to take the deadweight loss for D and add it to the deadweight loss for F. Don't just assume that you can take the deadweight loss for F and multiply it by 2. That is true frequently, but that is not true all of the time. And note in this example, we can see that that's not going to be the case because the difference here is going to be 10 for F for the base. And for D, it's going to be 15. So just kind of remember that when you're on the next midterm, when you're thinking about how to compute deadweight loss, that they're not always going to be the same. Okay, does anyone have any questions before we move on to quotas?
I have a,
Yeah.
sorry, you can go ahead.
So for tariffs, you said that they increase imports. I thought the point of a tariff was to decrease imports.
Yes, yeah, so it is decreasing imports. I apologize if I misspoke. Yeah, it's decreasing imports, but
Okay.
they are taxing the imports.
Okay. All right, good.
I think someone else had another question too.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So none of these will be on this midterm, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, chapter 3 and 9 will not be on this midterm.
But I think that we do have taxations on this midterm too, right? But is it different than this?
Yeah, so it is different than this. It's not going to be on the tariffs. It's just going to be on like the taxation that we previously looked at where, and I'll draw a quick example. So we had taxation like that. So there was just the domestic market that we're thinking about, not the international market. Did anyone else have any other questions? Okay. So import quotas are, I feel like they're a lot more complicated to think through, but they're actually basically the same thing as a tariff. So the difference between an import quota and a tariff are import quotas are just saying there is a limit on the quantity of goods that a country can import. So a tariff is basically a tax on imported goods, where a quota is basically saying we are going to allow, let's say Canada. So the United States is going to allow Canada to import 20 cotton shirts into the United States, only 20. And so rather than set up a tariff, what this does is the government basically is giving certain foreign producers the ability to import goods into the country, but only a specific amount or quantity of that good. So when we're looking at the kind of what a quota looks like, it looks different than a tariff. Because remember, in this case, there is not a flat price. So because of that, the benefits look a little different. So we have this new curve here that's going to be our effectively supply curve after the quota. And so in this case, the government is going to allow a specific number of imports. So basically, and we can actually see that, so the government's going to allow 30 imports of t-shirts into this country. So what that does then is you can see that this, so the difference between 70 and 40 is going to be our imports. But rather than having this flat curve like we normally did, we actually have the supply curve moving up here and actually transitioning to mirror the normal supply curve. And the reason for that is because now that there's a quota, there cannot be any more goods brought into a country. Once you hit 30, that's it. That's all of the imports that can be brought into a country under the quota. So the difference here, and I'm going to kind of walk through on this side, is basically consumer surplus is going to be the same as under a tariff. Producer surplus is also going to be the same because it's just going to be that same process. So domestic consumer surplus, domestic producer surplus are going to be the same. Foreign profits, so what foreign producers of the good make, that's also going to be the same because the tariff revenue is going to not change because the quota mirrors the tariff. And then finally, deadweight loss is also going to be the same, even though it looks a little different because we have this weird chunk here, G, that is now a domestic producer benefit, whereas before we had this chunk right here. So now there's kind of a trade-off between those two. But the difference is that the tariff revenue is just going to the foreign firms as profit. And the reason for that is just because those firms can produce that specific amount of the good. And since the government isn't taxing the good, the foreign firms are just going to benefit from the difference between the $20 domestic price and wherever the new supply curve intersects with the demand curve. So you can basically say this intersection point in whatever price this is, that is going to be the new world price in this example. Okay, and let me pause here and see if there are any questions, because I think quotas are kind of weird to think through compared to tariffs.
So with a quota, there's no actual tax, right? It's just that the government benefits zero from it, like financially, correct?
Exactly, yeah.
So then how does another country benefit from it financially?
Yeah, so like, remember in the tariff example that there was a $10 tax, so the difference between 20 and 30, that was the $10 tariff. But in this example, there's no tariff. The government is just saying you can only import 30 units of the good. So the world price is $20, but because of the quota, the domestic price is now actually $30. So what happens is foreign producers still produce at a price of $20, but they don't have to pay that $10 tariff when they're importing the goods. And so because of that, they're actually still getting the difference between 20 and 30, and that's just going to them as profits.
Okay, I thought that it would just stay at 20.
Yeah, so yeah, kind of weird that like quotas aren't used very much because they actually benefit like foreign companies and not the government, but it occasionally is used.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any other questions on this or any of the material that we went over? Because I'm going to jump into the questions that you all had asked on Top Hat if no one has any other questions. Okay, so then let's take a look at the questions that you all had from Top Hat. Okay, so the first question was, I believe, from the Chapter 3 pre-lecture quiz. So this question was asking, so in an hour, Mateo can wash 2 cars or mow 1 lawn, and Sophia can wash 3 cars or mow 1 lawn. So who has the absolute advantage in washing cars and the absolute advantage in lawn mowing? So in this case, Sophia has the absolute advantage in car washing because she can wash 1 more car than Mateo can, but in lawn mowing, there's no difference. So there's no difference between Sophia and Mateo. For the next question though, this is where we're looking at comparative advantage. And let me actually make this a little bigger so you can see the original numbers. So similar to how I talked about previously for opportunity cost, we're going to take the 1 for lawn for Mateo and divide that by the 2 for cars for Mateo. And then that's going to give us Mateo's opportunity cost of car washing. And we're going to do that for all of Mateo's different goods and Sophia's different goods. So when we do that, we can actually see that even though Mateo doesn't have an absolute advantage in anything, he actually does have a comparative advantage in mowing lawns, whereas Sophia has a comparative advantage in washing cars. So we're just looking for the lowest opportunity cost. And let me know if anyone has any questions on that. Okay. So then for the next one, kind of basically the same setup. So in this case, we're looking at Kyla can cook dinner in 30 minutes and wash the laundry in 20 minutes. And her roommate takes twice as long to do each task. So the question is, how should the roommates allocate the work? So once again, we're just going to take the opportunity cost. And we can see when we take the opportunity cost that they actually have the same trade-offs. So because of that, there's actually going to be no gains from trade because no person has a lower opportunity cost. So there's not really going to be any gain because there's no difference between the opportunity costs. Okay. And I had quite a few questions on taxation. And so someone did ask to the kind of an example of taxation that you will have on the exam. So this is something that you could have on the exam where it's asking for a tax wedge. And how do you think about the tax wedge? So in this example, the tax is $3. And the price that consumers pay is going to be this $5 price right here. And the price that producers get is going to be $2 right here. So if I was going to map the consumer and producer surplus, this is going to be producer surplus. So that'll be PS. This is going to be consumer surplus. This is going to be the government tax revenue. And then finally, this is going to be deadweight loss. So this is a type of tax question that you could see on the exam, and it would be reasonable for them to ask you, what is the consumer surplus after tax, producer surplus, tax revenue, and deadweight loss. So if I was just, and I'll calculate deadweight loss because I had some questions on that. So you're doing the 1/2. And in this case, it's going to be the difference between 4 and 2. So you're going to have 4 minus 2 times the amount of the tax. And so that's how you would calculate deadweight loss for this specific example. And then just to kind of further think about that tax question. So we have a couple different lines in here. So for example, if this, this pink line was actually the tax, this tax would basically be the price that producers receive would be $2.50, and the price that consumers pay would be $4.75, and the tax is $2.25. So that's kind of how you think about the tax wedge, because I know I had a lot of questions on that. So the tax wedge is basically the intersection point on the demand curve and the intersection point on the supply curve in the difference between those two. So this difference right here has to be $2.50, or basically has to be the amount of the tax. Does anyone have any questions on that, or any questions on tax wedges? Excellent. Okay. So another question, I think this was also from the pre-lecture quiz for chapter 9. So this question was basically asking, so when a nation opens itself up to trade in a good, it becomes an importer. So the correct answer was producer surplus decreases, but consumer surplus and total surplus increase. And so I kind of drew an example that hopefully is a little helpful. But basically, when a country becomes an importer, that means that the world price is below the natural domestic price. So because of that, consumer surplus is going to be this entire triangle. So A, B, C, D, E, and F, whereas producer surplus is just going to be G. And so because of that, producer surplus is going to decrease, consumer surplus and total surplus are going to increase. Consumer surplus is because we can see that consumer surplus is gaining C, D, E, and F. And total surplus is increasing because E and F were previously not available under the domestic market. So because of that, everyone is benefiting. Okay. And I think I'm probably going to run out of time, but I do want to get through all these questions. So if you have to leave, that's totally fine. I totally understand. I hate when professors keep me over. So if you do have to leave, please leave. But I will finish going through all of the questions that students ask me. So for the next question, this one was talking about the country of Ataturk does not allow international trade. So in this country, you can buy a wool suit for 3 ounces of gold. Meanwhile, in the neighboring country, you can buy the same suit for 2 ounces of gold. So what this suggests is that this country does not have a comparative advantage in the production of suits. And the reason for that is if you look at the trade, you can see that it is taking this country quite a bit longer to produce a wool suit compared to its neighbor. So because of that, you know that it does not have the comparative advantage because it's taking so much longer for them to produce that good. So that's why you know that D would be correct. And this way of thinking about it is kind of the reverse from how we normally think about it, where we think about the lowest opportunity cost is best. And the reason why you know that that's not the case, or you need to think about it differently for this question, is because this word right here, you can buy. So it's talking about basically the reverse of how we normally think about it. And because of that, you need to flip the normal understanding. So because it's asking about purchasing rather than production, you know that you need to flip the understanding. Okay. And then another question was asking about, so basically you have this figure and there's a tax of $2 per packet that's imposed in this market. So what will the new equilibrium quantity be in this market? So the reason why it's going to be between 60 and 100 is because we know that the tax is going to be $2 per pack. And so because of that, we know that this tax right here, so in the example, they tell us that this particular quantity of 60, there would be a tax of $4. So we know that to get to a tax of $2, it's going to have to be a quantity greater than 60, but less than 100. So basically, any point between these two will be the quantity, but we don't know specifically where because the question didn't give us that information. So that's how we would compute that for this question. Okay, and then the next question was from, I think this is from the practice midterm synchronous review. So from last semester's practice exam, and it's question 4. So this one is asking, so suppose market demand is given by this equation. So there's the equation. And then if the market equilibrium price rises from 10 to 15, which statement is true? So this question is actually kind of nice because we don't have to find the equilibrium price because it tells us that. So what we need to do is just plug in the first equilibrium price, which is $10, into the equation, which gives us an equilibrium quantity of 20. Then we need to figure out, because remember, we're computing consumer surplus. So we need to determine what is the maximum price. So basically, what is the price where the demand curve intersects with the price line? And so in this case, that's going to be a 20. And we figure that out by just putting 0 into the demand equation for quantity and then solving. So for the original consumer surplus, now we're going to take the $20, which is going to be the quantity. So we're taking the equilibrium quantity. Then we're going to take the equilibrium price. And then finally, the maximum price. This is maximum price. And this is the equilibrium quantity. And so that's going to give us the $100 original consumer surplus. So now to find the difference, if the price rises to 15, the only thing that we need to do now is just find out what the new equilibrium quantity is at a price of 15. So we just need to plug 15 into the demand equation, which gives us 10. And then compute the new consumer surplus, which in this case is going to use the $10 quantity, the $20 maximum, which we got from all the way up here when we computed it previously, and then the new equilibrium price, which is 15. So when we do that, we get a consumer surplus of 25. And so to get the change, basically all we need to do is just take 100 minus 25, and that's going to give us a $75 change in consumer surplus, which in this case is going to be A. Okay, and before I move to the final question, does anyone have any questions on the prior examples that I went over? Okay, so for the final question, I believe this is from the same midterm review as the prior question. So this one's basically saying that they're giving you the demand and supply, and they're basically saying there is going to be a price ceiling in this market. And so you know now from the question that there are 40 drinks that are going to be bought and sold. So because of that, and I included this graph because I think it's really helpful, you know that you need to plug in the 40 quantity into the supply equation. So you're going to plug in the 40, which would be that point, and you just need to solve for that. So basically take the 5 plus 1 over 20 times Q, solve that, and you get 7, which in this case is going to give us B. Okay, and I think that is it as far as the questions I had from Top Hat.